On a bitter winter night in Duluth, Minnesota, former U.S. Marine Gideon Hale pulled into a convenience store after his shift at the docks, expecting nothing more than silence and snow. Instead, behind the building, under a flickering security light, he saw a German shepherd digging through a trash bin, ribs showing, fur matted with ice. A store employee stormed out, shouting, kicking the bin, hurling a plastic crate that struck the dog's side. The shepherd flinched, but didn't run. It simply stood there, back lowered, eyes steady, not wild, not begging, disciplined, watching, waiting. When the man raised a broom to drive it off, Gideon stepped forward. Enough! The dog turned toward him. And in that gaze, sharp, measured, soldier still, Gideon felt something crack open inside his chest. He bought 2 hot meals. The shepherd didn't touch the food, until Gideon gave a small nod. And in that quiet moment, a Marine who had sworn he would never protect another soul again realized this was no ordinary stray, and that some ghosts don't stay buried. Have you ever met a soul at the exact moment you needed saving? Tell me where you're watching from, and if you believe God sends second chances, comment below. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes loyalty never dies. Duluth, Minnesota did not ease anyone gently into winter. It buried the city whole. By late January, Lake Superior looked less like water and more like a sleeping steel beast under sheets of wind-blown snow. The air cut through wool and denim alike, sharp enough to sting the lungs. The harbor cranes stood like skeletal sentries against the gray sky, their metal arms creaking in protest whenever the wind shifted off the lake. Gideon Hale preferred it this way. At 41, he had the broad, deliberate build of a man who had once moved through deserts and rooftops with calculated precision. 6'2", shoulders still squared by muscle memory, he carried himself with the posture of someone who had never fully set down his rifle, even if he no longer owned one. His dark hair was threaded with early streaks of gray, cut short in practical military fashion. A faint scar ran along his jawline, pale against wind-reddened skin. He wore what he always wore, a faded gray t-shirt beneath a red and black flannel shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal forearms roped with sinew, dark blue jeans, brown leather boots, scuffed but meticulously maintained. Former Marine recon. 3 years ago, he had led a joint operation in northern Syria alongside a private military contractor known as Vanguard Tactical Solutions. The mission briefing had been simple: intercept a weapons convoy, extract quietly. The intelligence packet had indicated minimal resistance. Minimal. The ambush had been surgical. 2 of his men, Corporal Luis Mendez and Sergeant Travis Brick Dalton, never made it to exfil, and Atlas, the canine attached to their unit, a sable-coated German shepherd with amber eyes and unshakable loyalty, had died shielding Brick from incoming fire. The official report labeled it a combat accident due to unpredictable insurgent movement. Gideon had signed the document. He had not believed it. Now he worked maintenance at the Duluth shipping docks on the night shift, checking hydraulic systems, clearing frozen lines, repairing anything that cracked under the cold. The job required silence, isolation, and minimal conversation, 3 things he had come to rely on. He lived 20 miles north of the city, in a small timber cabin tucked among white pines near the shoreline of Lake Superior. The cabin had once belonged to his uncle. It had one wood-burning stove, a narrow bed, a sturdy oak table, and a view of endless gray water. There were no photographs on the walls, no television, no dog bowl by the door, especially not a dog bowl. Inside his bedroom, the top drawer of his nightstand held a single object wrapped in cloth: Atlas's collar, black nylon, reinforced stitching, worn where Gideon's gloved hand had gripped it countless times. The metal tag still faintly scratched with the dog's call sign. He had not opened that drawer in months. When he did, it was only to confirm it was still there, like proof that grief had mass and weight. He did not attend veteran meetups in town. The Duluth Veterans Outreach Center had reached out twice after he returned home. The woman who left the voicemail the second time introduced herself as Sarah Whitaker. Sarah was in her late 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair usually tied back in a practical low bun. She stood about 5'7", lean rather than delicate, and moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had rebuilt her life from fracture. Her husband, a National Guard medic, had died during a flood rescue in Iowa. The loss had not made her bitter, it had sharpened her compassion. She now coordinated counseling services and community events for returning service members, greeting each one with the same steady gaze that refused to pity but invited honesty. Gideon had never returned her calls. He had nothing to offer a room full of men trying to relearn how to live. He was alive. That was the problem. On the night shift, the wind whipped harder than usual, rattling sheet metal against the loading bays. Gideon tightened a frozen coupling line, while the harbor lights flickered faintly in the distance. Snow swept sideways across the dock like fine ash. The dock supervisor, Martin Keene, a thick-set man in his 50s, with frost-cracked knuckles and a beard perpetually dusted with sawdust, passed by and grunted, "Storm's picking up. You heading back up north after this?" "Yeah." Martin studied him for a second. Martin was the sort who asked questions only once. He had worked docks his entire life, and carried grief quietly too. Lost a brother to a bar fight decades ago. He didn't push. "Drive slow," he muttered, then moved on. Gideon clocked out at 1:43 a.m. Snow layered thick over the windshield of his old Ford pickup. The engine coughed twice before turning over. The heater blew lukewarm air at best. As he drove north along the shoreline road, Lake Superior disappeared behind sheets of white. The highway lights blurred into halos. Duluth receded into darkness. He had built his life around absence. No dog, no partner, no calls returned. He told himself it was discipline. That isolation was protection. But some nights, when the wind shifted just right, he swore he could still hear rotor blades slicing through desert air. He reached his cabin close to 2:30 a.m. The structure stood sturdy against the pines. Snow banked high against its wooden sides. Gideon cut the engine and sat in the truck for a moment longer than necessary. The world outside was silent, except for wind scraping ice across branches. Inside, he fed the stove with split logs and watched flames crawl upward. The warmth spread slowly. He removed his boots, lined them neatly beside the door. The cabin smelled faintly of pine resin and smoke. He moved through his nightly ritual with mechanical precision, washing hands, pouring black coffee, even though he did not intend to sleep for another hour, checking the lock twice. Then, without meaning to, he opened the top drawer of his nightstand. The cloth-wrapped collar lay exactly where he had left it. He did not unwrap it. He simply looked. A flash of memory struck without warning. Atlas bounding forward during training, ears erect, tail cutting through dust. Atlas sitting at Gideon's knee awaiting command. Atlas's final lunge. Gideon shut the drawer quickly. His jaw tightened. "You don't get another one," he muttered to the empty room. He believed it. He believed he had forfeited the right to care for another life the moment his team walked into that kill zone under faulty intelligence. The Vanguard liaison had insisted the intel came from verified satellite intercepts. The coordinates had been triple-checked. Yet the insurgents had known their exact approach vector. 2 Marines dead, 1 K-9 dead, a clean narrative filed away. Gideon lay down on the narrow bed fully clothed, except for his boots. The wind battered the cabin walls. The lake groaned under shifting ice. He closed his eyes. In sleep, the desert returned. Brick shouting over comms, Luis yelling for suppressive fire, Atlas charging through dust, then static. He woke before dawn, breath shallow, hands clenched into fists. The cabin remained dark except for dying embers in the stove. Survived. That word echoed often. Survived, but never returned. By morning, snow had accumulated another 6 inches. Gideon shoveled the porch in methodical strokes. His beard had frosted over by the time he finished. He drove back toward Duluth before sunset for another shift. The city lights flickered again against the lake's edge. He did not know that by midnight, behind a convenience store under another flickering security lamp, his carefully constructed isolation would fracture. For now, he remained what he had chosen to be, a Marine who had lived, and a man who refused to come home. The snow came harder after midnight. By the time Gideon Hale turned his truck into the convenience store parking lot, wind was driving white sheets across the asphalt like torn paper. The security light behind the building flickered again, throwing long, uneven shadows across the dumpsters. He had not meant to stop. He had meant to go home. But something in him had not settled since the end of his shift. When he stepped around the back of the store, he saw the shepherd again. The dog stood near the dented metal dumpster, ribs sharp beneath sable fur thickened by winter, but still too lean. Snow clung to its muzzle. One ear stood upright, The other bore a small nick along the edge, healed long ago. Its posture was wrong for a stray. Not crouched, not pleading, balanced, measured. The store employee from earlier, his name tag read Caleb, stood several feet away, broom in hand. Caleb was mid-20s, tall and wiry, with a nervous energy that never seemed to rest. His sandy hair hung too long over his eyes, and his jacket bore the stiff logo of corporate uniformity. He had grown up in Duluth, left for a year after high school, returned when his father's drinking worsened. Hard edges had formed early in him, resentment disguised as toughness. "You again," Caleb muttered when he saw Gideon. The Marine's voice was calm. "He bothering anyone?" Caleb shrugged. "It's freezing. He'll be gone by morning." Gideon looked at the dog. The shepherd did not avert its gaze. There was something in those eyes, alert but restrained. No panic, no desperation, just awareness. Gideon stepped closer, boots crunching against ice. The dog shifted slightly but did not retreat. Its body language wasn't submission, it was evaluation. "You want him?" Caleb asked, irritation dulled by the cold. "Take him." Gideon said nothing. He crouched slowly, keeping his hands visible. The dog's head tilted just slightly to the right, a micro-adjustment that made Gideon's breath catch. Atlas used to do that. The Marine stood up and walked back inside the store without explanation. He returned with 2 hot meals sealed in plastic containers and a bottle of water. The shepherd did not lunge, did not sniff wildly. It watched. Gideon set one container on the ground and stepped back. The dog glanced at him, waited. Gideon hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he gave the smallest nod. "Go." The shepherd lowered its head and began eating. Controlled, efficient, no frantic gulping. Caleb stared. "That's weird." Gideon didn't answer, because he already knew. This was not a stray. The drive back north was slower this time. Snow layered thick over the highway. The shepherd lay in the truck bed at first, steady and silent. But when the wind intensified, Gideon stopped and opened the passenger door instead. Inside, the dog leapt in smoothly, no hesitation, curling into the footwell as though accustomed to vehicle transport. Gideon's chest tightened. 3 years. 3 years since he had allowed a dog into this cab. He kept his eyes forward. The cabin lights flickered on when they arrived. The wind pressed against the pine boards. The lake beyond was a shifting gray void. Gideon opened the door and stepped inside. The shepherd remained seated in the snow outside, watching, waiting. Gideon frowned. "You're coming in or not?" The dog approached, but stopped at the threshold. It did not cross. It looked up at him. Permission. Gideon swallowed. Inside. The shepherd stepped over the threshold only after the command. The air inside smelled of smoke and pine. The dog paused just inside the door. Then, instead of wandering, it moved deliberately through the small cabin. First the back window, then the side window. A brief glance toward the bedroom. Then it circled once and lay down near the front door, positioned where it could see both entrance and hallway. Gideon stood frozen. "Clear the perimeter," he muttered under his breath. The dog's ears twitched at the word clear. It was subtle, but it was there. He fetched an old wool blanket from a storage chest and placed it near the stove. The shepherd did not move until he gestured toward it. Bed. The dog lay down precisely on the blanket. Not beside it, on it. Gideon exhaled slowly. "You're not feral," he said quietly. The dog watched him. Up close now, Gideon could see more detail. Faint scars along the shoulder, small puncture marks long healed near the hind flank, training harness wear. Teeth clean, nails clipped once, not long ago. Estimated age, 4, maybe 5. Too young to have lived entirely on the streets, too disciplined to have forgotten training. He poured water into a bowl and set it down. The shepherd did not drink until he stepped back and nodded again. Gideon felt something stir in his chest, part recognition, part resistance. He sat at the oak table and stared at the fire. "I'll take you to the shelter in the morning," he said aloud, more to himself than to the animal. The Duluth Animal Rescue operated near the industrial district. He had driven past it before. A clean facility, volunteers, adoption process. He told himself that was the plan. The dog rested its chin on its paws but did not fully relax. Every time wind struck the cabin wall, its ears lifted. Then, sometime past 3 a.m., A distant sound rolled over the lake. A helicopter. Not close, just passing. But the shepherd's reaction was immediate. Its body stiffened, breathing quickened. It did not bark. It did not panic. It lowered itself to the ground, pressing close to the floorboards. Atlas had done that once during a medevac under fire. Gideon stood up slowly. "Easy," he murmured. The shepherd's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. Then, gradually, it settled. Gideon's pulse had already spiked. He hadn't heard rotor blades over the lake in months. He told himself it was civilian transport. He lay down on his bed, fully clothed again. The dog remained near the door. Sleep came unevenly. When it did, it dragged him back into desert heat and shattered radio static. He saw Luis fall. He heard Brick shouting coordinates. He saw Atlas charge, then fire. He jerked awake with a strangled breath. The cabin was dark, except for ember glow, and weight, gentle, steady weight against his chest. The shepherd had moved silently during the nightmare. It lay beside him now, head resting just below his sternum. Not pressing heavily, just enough contact, grounding, canine stabilization training. His breathing slowed without conscious effort. The dog did not look at him. It simply remained. Gideon stared at the ceiling for a long time. "You're not a stray," he whispered. Morning light crept through frost-coated windows. Snow had softened the world into silence. The shepherd rose when he did, but did not follow him into the small washroom without command. When he stepped outside to split wood, the dog waited inside the doorway. Disciplined, attentive, unlost. He leaned against the porch railing and studied the frozen lake. "You need a name," he muttered. He did not want to choose one. Names made things real. Names made things harder to let go. He looked at the dog again. Strong, quiet, resilient, survivor. "Ronan," he said finally. It was a name he had once considered for Atlas before settling on something simpler. The dog's ears twitched. Ronan. The shepherd met his gaze. Not submissive, not dominant. Connected. Gideon exhaled slowly. He still intended to drive into Duluth later. Still intended to hand Ronan over to professionals. That was the responsible choice. But as Ronan positioned himself by the cabin door, alert, watchful, Gideon felt something he had not permitted in 3 years. Not guilt, not grief, recognition. This dog had not been discarded by accident. This dog had been trained. And somewhere, someone had made a decision to let him go. The wind shifted across Lake Superior, carrying faint echoes across ice. Ronan lifted his head toward the sound. Gideon watched him carefully, and for the first time since signing that mission report, a single thought surfaced with clarity. This wasn't coincidence. He still told himself it would only be one night, but deep down, he already knew. This was not just a stray he had rescued from the cold. This was something else entirely, and whatever had shaped Ronan's discipline had not disappeared. It was waiting, just like the truth Gideon had buried. Morning light in Duluth did not arrive with warmth. It arrived pale and reluctant, filtered through clouds that pressed low over Lake Superior like unfinished thoughts. Snow from the previous night clung to pine branches around Gideon's cabin, bending them toward the earth. Ronan sat by the door before Gideon even reached for his boots. He had already decided. The Duluth Animal Rescue would open at 9. He would drive Ronan into town, have him scanned, hand him over if there was an owner. That was the responsible thing. He repeated it in his head twice before starting the truck. The drive south was quiet, except for the rumble of the engine and the faint hum of tires over salted pavement. Ronan sat upright in the passenger seat this time, gaze forward, posture composed. Not restless, not distracted, alert. Duluth rose slowly ahead. Industrial cranes, brick warehouses, church steeples softened by snow. The rescue center sat on the edge of the harbor district, in a renovated warehouse painted pale blue. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar shavings. A young receptionist looked up as Gideon entered. She wore oversized glasses and had dark hair pulled into a messy bun, a pen tucked behind one ear. Her name tag read, Lena. Lena appeared early 20s, small-framed but quick in movement, the kind of person who carried nervous enthusiasm like armor. She smiled when she saw Ronan. "Oh, wow," she breathed. "He's beautiful." Gideon only nodded. "I just need him scanned," he said. Lena's smile softened slightly. She had seen this type before. The detached tone, the deliberate distance. "Of course, Dr. Whitmore's in today." She disappeared through a swinging door and returned moments later with a woman in her early 40s. Dr. Hannah Whitmore had calm eyes and silver threading through her dark brown hair, cut short around her jaw. She stood about 5'8", posture straight but unhurried. Her voice carried warmth without excess. Years ago, she had lost her own rescue dog during a wildfire evacuation, an event that had reshaped her career from large animal practice to shelter medicine. Loss had made her gentler, not guarded. "Let's see what we've got," she said, kneeling slowly in front of Ronan. Ronan did not flinch. He watched her hands carefully. "May I?" she asked Gideon before touching the dog. Gideon gave a brief nod. The vet passed the scanner along Ronan's shoulder. Nothing. She moved lower along the rib cage. The scanner beeped, a small, precise sound that seemed too loud in the room. Dr. Whitmore frowned slightly, turning the device toward the screen. Lena leaned in from behind the counter. Gideon's pulse slowed. He did not realize he had been holding his breath. The screen populated with text. Owner, Vanguard Tactical Solutions. Status, decommissioned. For a moment, the room felt smaller. The words blurred. Vanguard Tactical Solutions. The name struck with the force of memory rather than surprise. Gideon did not blink. He did not move. Dr. Whitmore glanced up at him. "Do you know this organization?" Gideon's voice came steady but lower. Yes. Vanguard had been the private military contractor attached to his failed operation 3 years earlier. They had provided logistics, surveillance data, drone overwatch. They had assured him the intel was clean. Decommissioned. The word pressed harder than owner. Decommissioned. "That's an unusual term," Lena whispered. Dr. Whitmore scrolled further. "The chip's active, but the primary data logs look altered." "Altered how?" Gideon asked. "There's a modification timestamp about 8 months ago," she said. "Owner records partially scrubbed, but there's a secondary identifier still intact." She tapped the screen again. A string of numbers and letters appeared. K9 Batch ID VT-K9-17A. Gideon's vision sharpened. Atlas had been assigned VT-K9-17C. Same batch, same training cycle. He felt his jaw tighten. Dr. Whitmore continued. "This batch designation suggests he was part of a contracted working dog program, likely military or paramilitary training." "He's trained," Gideon said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "And recently, his conditioning hasn't degraded much." Lena crossed her arms, brows knitting together. Why would they mark a dog as decommissioned and just let him go? Dr. Whitmore's expression darkened slightly. Private contractors sometimes retire animals after operational use, but typically they're rehomed, not abandoned. Gideon stared at the word again. Decommissioned. The official report for his mission had used similar phrasing. Operational loss. Asset neutralized. Words that made death easier to catalog. Dr. Whitmore turned the monitor slightly so he could see more clearly. There's also a note in the system about 3 other K9 units from this same contractor flagged as inactive within the last 2 years. Inactive? Lena repeated. Which often means no verified adoption record, Dr. Whitmore clarified. Gone. Gideon's mind ran quietly, mechanically. Atlas, 17C. Ronan, 17A. Same cohort, same handler program. And Vanguard. He swallowed. Is there any contact listed? He asked. Dr. Whitmore shook her head. The primary contact field was wiped, but the subcode suggests internal reassignment before decommissioning. Meaning? Lena asked. Meaning someone made a deliberate decision. Silence settled. Ronan remained seated at Gideon's side, posture aligned, gaze fixed forward. He had not whined, not shifted, not reacted to the sterile environment like a lost animal. He was waiting. Gideon felt something colder than winter settle behind his ribs. Can you print that batch ID? He asked. Dr. Whitmore hesitated briefly, then nodded. Yes. The printer whirred softly. While waiting, Lena crouched beside Ronan. You're not supposed to be on the streets, are you? She murmured gently. Ronan glanced at her hand but did not lean into it. He looked back at Gideon, awaiting instruction. Dr. Whitmore handed Gideon the printout. "If you're thinking of keeping him," she said carefully, "you should know working dogs sometimes struggle transitioning to civilian life." Gideon met her gaze. "I know." She studied him for a moment. "You've worked with them before." "Yes." She did not press further. Outside, the wind scraped snow across the parking lot. Gideon folded the paper once and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you," he said. Lena smiled faintly. "He seems to trust you." Gideon did not answer that. Trust was not the word he would have chosen. Recognition felt closer. As they stepped outside, the sky had darkened again, threatening another round of lake-effect snow. Ronan paused briefly on the sidewalk, scanning the surroundings before stepping toward the truck. Disciplined, precise, same gait Atlas had. Inside the cab, Gideon closed the door and rested his hands on the steering wheel. 3 years. He had told himself the mission was chaos, unpredictable, war. But Vanguard had supplied the drone imagery, the approach vector, the reassurances. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket again and read the batch IDVT-K9-17A. Atlas had been 17C, same litter cycle, same training field in Arizona. He remembered the day Atlas had been paired with him. The handler had joked that the batch was unusually aggressive in drive testing. Ronan turned his head slightly toward him. Same amber eyes. Not identical, but close enough to stir something deep and unsettled. "Decommissioned," Gideon muttered. The truck heater hummed softly. Ronan shifted once and rested his chin near Gideon's knee, not seeking comfort, grounded, present. A thought surfaced slowly, unwelcome but undeniable. If Ronan had been removed intentionally, if other dogs from the same contractor had vanished, then this wasn't retirement. It was disposal. Gideon started the engine. Snow began to fall again, thick and quiet. As he pulled onto the road, Lake Superior stretched gray and infinite beside him. He had spent 3 years believing the mission had been a tragic inevitability. But what if it hadn't? What if Ronan wasn't just a stray survivor of someone else's negligence? What if he was evidence, a living fragment of a story rewritten on paper? Ronan watched the horizon as they drove north again. Gideon's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. The past had not finished with him, and for the first time since signing that report, he allowed himself to consider a possibility more dangerous than grief. The mission may not have failed. It may have been compromised. He did not speak the word out loud. Not yet, but the name Vanguard Tactical Solutions echoed inside him like a distant rotor blade. And Ronan, silent, disciplined, alive, sat beside him as if waiting for the next command. The snow followed them home like a silent witness. Gideon did not speak during the drive back to the cabin. Ronan sat steady in the passenger seat, amber eyes forward, body aligned with the movement of the truck, as though anticipating every turn before it happened. Inside the cabin, the fire was nearly out. Gideon fed it wood without removing his flannel, movements efficient, mind elsewhere. Vanguard Tactical Solutions, Batch 17A, decommissioned. He removed the folded printout from his jacket and laid it flat on the oak table. Ronan stood nearby, watching. Gideon stared at the batch ID for a long time before reaching for his phone. There was only one person he could call. Marcus Leland answered on the third ring. Marcus had once run recon alongside Gideon, lean and sharp-eyed, even back then. Now in his early 40s, he had traded desert camouflage for a journalist's leather jacket and ink-stained fingers. He stood about 6 feet tall, long-limbed, with a face that had thinned from stress rather than age. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a rooftop fall in Fallujah. After leaving the Corps, Marcus had refused corporate security jobs. Instead, he went to journalism school on the GI Bill. He now worked as an investigative reporter for a Minneapolis-based outlet that specialized in defense contracting oversight. He was known for asking questions others avoided. He also carried survivor's guilt of his own. "Gideon?" Marcus's voice sharpened immediately. "You okay? I need you to look something up." There was a pause. "Send it." Gideon texted the batch ID and the company name. The silence stretched on the line while Marcus typed. "You're kidding," Marcus murmured. "I wish. You find this dog where?" "Behind a convenience store." Another pause. "Gideon, this batch number rings something." "What?" "Give me an hour." The call ended. Gideon set the phone down. Ronan approached slowly and rested near the table, ears angled toward him. "You were there," Gideon muttered. Not a question, a statement forming. By evening, the snow thickened again. The lake groaned under shifting ice, wind scraping across its frozen skin. Gideon was splitting wood when headlights cut through the trees. Marcus stepped out of a mud-splattered SUV wearing a heavy wool coat over dark jeans, boots crunching against ice. His beard had grown thicker than in his Marine days, flecked with gray. He carried a weatherproof laptop bag slung across his shoulder. "You look like hell," Marcus said by way of greeting. "Drives bad?" Gideon asked. "Always is up here." Marcus noticed Ronan standing just inside the cabin door. He froze. "That's not a stray." "No." Inside, Marcus spread documents across the table. His energy shifted into something clinical. "Okay," he said, opening his laptop. "Here's what I found." The screen illuminated internal contract documents Marcus had obtained months earlier through a source inside a federal oversight committee. "Vanguard submitted operational readiness reports for your mission 3 days before deployment," Marcus said. Gideon leaned in. There were 2 K9 units listed. Gideon's chest tightened. Marcus tapped the screen. "Primary assigned K9, VT-K9-17A, Ronan. Alternate K9, VT-K9-17C, Atlas." Gideon felt the room tilt slightly. "They swapped them?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "There's an amendment filed 24 hours before deployment. It cites training irregularities for 17A, reassignment approved." "That's impossible," Gideon said. Marcus met his gaze. "You would have known if a dog in your unit had training issues." "Yes." Ronan stood still behind them, as though sensing the tension. "Here's the thing," Marcus continued. "The irregularity report doesn't match the internal evaluation logs." "What do you mean?" Marcus turned the laptop slightly. "The internal logs show 17A scoring above standard in scent tracking and perimeter control." "Then why pull him?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "There's more." He opened another file. Internal Vanguard correspondence, marked confidential. An email thread. Marcus read aloud. "Satellite intel confidence below verified threshold. Recommend delay pending secondary confirmation." Gideon's pulse pounded in his ears. "Date?" he asked. 2 days before deployment." "Who sent it?" "A Vanguard intelligence analyst, name redacted." "And?" Marcus scrolled further. "Reply from Executive Operations Director. Proceed as scheduled. Contract stipulates readiness demonstration window. Delay risks renewal terms." Gideon's hands clenched. "Readiness demonstration?" "Your mission wasn't just about the convoy," Marcus said quietly. "It was about proving Vanguard's integrated operational capability to secure future government contracts." The cabin felt too small, too tight. "You're saying they knew the intel wasn't verified?" "Yes." "And they deployed anyway?" "Yes." Gideon stared at the screen. Luis shouting over comms, Brick calling out coordinates, Atlas lunging forward. The ambush had been precise, insurgents positioned along their exact approach vector. "If 17A was primary," Gideon said slowly, "and they pulled him," Marcus nodded grimly. "Atlas replaced him." Silence filled the room. Ronan stepped forward and rested beside Gideon's chair. Alive. Atlas had died in that dust storm, because someone wanted to preserve a contract timeline. Gideon felt something shift inside him. For 3 years he had replayed every movement of that mission in his mind. Where he positioned the team, the timing of the breach, the call to advance. He had blamed himself, blamed instinct, blamed fate. "You didn't fail," Marcus said quietly, as though reading his thoughts. Gideon's voice was barely audible. "They sent us into an ambush." Marcus nodded, knowing the intel wasn't verified. Ronan lifted his head at the word ambush, ears alert. "He was there," Gideon said. Marcus looked toward the dog. "Yeah. If they hadn't pulled him, you don't know how that would have played out. But Atlas wouldn't have been there." The words broke something in his throat. Marcus closed the laptop gently. "This isn't public record yet," he said. "But it will be." Gideon looked at Ronan. Same batch, same training field. One pulled last minute, one deployed. One alive, one dead. "Why decommission him?" Gideon asked. Marcus leaned back slightly. "Loose ends." The word settled heavily. "If they knew the intel was compromised and your team died, they would need to limit traceability. And a K9 assigned to the original manifest would be documentation of that change." Gideon stood slowly. He walked to the bedroom. opened the nightstand drawer. For the first time in months, he unwrapped Atlas's collar. The nylon felt heavier than memory. He returned to the main room. Ronan watched him carefully. Gideon knelt. He held the collar in his hands for a long moment. "I thought it was my fault," he said quietly. Ronan did not move. "I thought I misread the terrain, misjudged the timing." The wind rattled the cabin windows. But they knew. Marcus stood in the doorway, silent witness. "They knew and sent us anyway." The words did not explode. They landed, solid, final. Gideon's eyes did not water. He did not break. But the weight he had carried shifted shape. It was no longer guilt. It was clarity. Ronan stepped forward and rested his chin gently against Gideon's knee, not seeking comfort, grounded, present, alive because someone had pulled him, Atlas dead because someone had not. Gideon closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't fail them," he said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "No." The fire crackled softly in the stove. Outside, snow fell over Lake Superior in slow, relentless silence. Inside, something long buried began to rise. Not grief, not yet anger. Truth. And truth was colder than winter. Gideon opened his eyes. He looked at Ronan. "You were supposed to be there," he whispered. And for the first time since the desert, he allowed himself to believe something he had refused to consider. The mission had not been chaos. It had been calculated, and he had been used. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with understanding. The truth did not bring peace. It brought movement. Snow fell thick and slow across the shoreline north of Duluth, layering Gideon Hale's cabin in white silence. Lake Superior lay frozen beneath a steel sky, wind sweeping across its surface in long, low murmurs. Marcus had left before dawn, promising to encrypt copies of the internal Vanguard files and secure additional confirmations from his federal oversight source. "Give me 48 hours, he had said, "and don't do anything reckless." Gideon had nodded. Reckless was no longer the word that fit. Ronan stood by the cabin door that afternoon, ears pricked, gaze fixed toward the tree line. Gideon hadn't heard anything yet. He was stacking split pine logs along the outer wall when Ronan's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable. His head lifted slightly, his body angled toward the north ridge, muscles tightened beneath sable fur. "What is it?" Gideon asked quietly. The dog did not bark. He shifted one paw forward, listening. Gideon stilled himself. 5 seconds later, faint beneath the wind, an engine, low, idling. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He stepped inside the cabin and moved toward the narrow window overlooking the dirt road that curved toward the property. A black SUV sat half-hidden beyond the trees, not a local vehicle, not mud-streaked like logging trucks or snowmobiles common to the area. It was clean, dark, idle exhaust barely visible in the cold. Gideon did not move for a long moment. Ronan's ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but in focus. The SUV did not advance. It simply waited. After 2 minutes, the engine cut. Silence again. Gideon counted slowly in his head. 1 minute. 2. 3. No footsteps approached. He stepped outside deliberately, boots crunching in snow. The SUV engine restarted instantly. It reversed without turning headlights on and disappeared down the ridge road. Ronan remained beside Gideon's leg, watching. "They found us," Gideon said quietly. Not with panic, with recognition. That night the wind grew sharper. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Gideon sat at the table with the documents Marcus had printed. Ronan lay near the door, though his head remained upright. "They don't decommission assets quietly if they don't care," Gideon muttered. Ronan's gaze flicked toward him. "They care." The thought pressed hard. Vanguard had erased records, reassigned K-9 units, scrubbed intel flags, and now, a vehicle in the snow. Coincidence felt naive. He picked up his phone. Marcus answered immediately. "They know," Gideon said. A pause. "What happened?" "Black SUV, sat near the cabin, left when I stepped outside." Marcus inhaled sharply. "I haven't published anything." "Doesn't matter." Silence crackled over the line. "Gideon, you have 2 options," Marcus said finally. "Lay low, move the dog, or go public immediately and force visibility." Gideon looked at Ronan. "Move the dog, send him away, safe, disconnected." The thought twisted something deep. I can drop him at the shelter tonight, Gideon said. You'd protect him that way, Marcus replied. But Ronan shifted closer to Gideon's knee, sensing tension. He did not tremble. He did not retreat. He leaned forward slightly, weight aligned with Gideon's leg, grounded, present. Gideon hung up. The fire crackled softly. Outside, snow thickened. He stood and walked to the bedroom. The drawer waited. 3 years. 3 years since he had unwrapped Atlas's collar. He opened it slowly. The cloth lay folded precisely where he had left it. This time, he did not hesitate. He lifted the collar. The nylon felt worn but intact, metal tag cold against his palm. He ran his thumb across the engraving. Atlas. His throat tightened. Not from grief, from memory. I blamed myself, he said quietly. Ronan stepped into the doorway behind him. I replayed that mission every night. Thought if I'd delayed 5 seconds, if I'd taken a different approach vector. He swallowed. I thought I failed you. Ronan watched him, amber eyes steady. Gideon knelt slowly and held the collar in both hands. I told myself I didn't deserve another dog. The wind struck the cabin wall hard. But it wasn't my failure. He exhaled slowly. They sent us into an ambush. The words were no longer accusation. They were fact. Ronan moved closer and sat directly in front of him, waiting, listening. I sentenced myself, Gideon said softly, for 3 years. The cabin felt smaller, more honest. And now they're watching. He stood and walked back into the main room. Ronan followed. The black SUV did not return that night, but Gideon slept lightly. Every creak of wood, every shift of wind, every distant engine. At 2:13 a.m., Ronan rose abruptly, not barking, not pacing, alert. Gideon sat up instantly. Silence pressed hard. Then, a faint crunch of tires on packed snow. Closer this time. The engine idled only briefly before cutting. Gideon moved to the side window and peered through a thin gap in the curtain. Headlights off. Vehicle positioned further down the road this time. Closer. He did not step outside. He stood in full view of the window deliberately. Let them see him. The SUV remained still for nearly a minute. Then the engine roared softly and pulled away. Ronan did not relax for another 30 seconds. Gideon returned to the table and sat down. He stared at Atlas's collar resting beside the documents. I could send you away, he said to Ronan. The dog tilted his head slightly. You'd be safe. But Ronan did not move toward the door. He moved closer to Gideon instead, placed his chin lightly against the Marine's thigh, not seeking comfort, standing ground. The choice crystallized slowly. He could run, disappear further north, drop Ronan at the shelter, tell Marcus to stop digging, or he could stop hiding. The thought settled with clarity. He had survived the desert. He had survived guilt. He would not survive cowardice. Gideon lifted Atlas's collar again. This time, he did not put it back in the drawer. He carried it into the main room and set it openly on the table. A memorial no longer hidden. He crouched in front of Ronan. I won't abandon you, he said quietly. Ronan held his gaze. The Marine's voice steadied. They already manipulated one mission. The wind howled briefly against the lake. They don't get another. He rose and walked toward the front door. Ronan stood instantly. Gideon opened the door and stepped into the cold. Snow drifted sideways beneath a pale moon. The ridge road was empty, but tracks remained, fresh tire impressions cutting through white. He studied them calmly. They're watching, he murmured. Ronan stepped beside him, body aligned, guarding, not afraid, alive because someone had pulled him from the deployment list, Atlas dead because someone had not. Gideon inhaled the sharp air deeply. For 3 years he had hidden from the memory of that mission. Now the mission was looking back at him. He stepped back inside and closed the door. The cabin felt warmer somehow, not safer, but steadier. He returned to the table and picked up his phone again. Marcus answered on the first ring. I'm not running, Gideon said. There was a beat of silence. Good, Marcus replied quietly. Gideon glanced at Ronan. We finished this. Outside, the wind erased the tire tracks slowly. Inside, Gideon Hale made a decision he had avoided for 3 years. He would not surrender the dog. He would not bury the truth. He would not retreat into guilt again. The past had come to his door, and this time, he would open it. Winter did not break when the article went live. There was no sunrise haloing Lake Superior in gold, no sudden thaw, no cinematic clearing of skies. Snow still pressed against the shoreline like a patient weight. But something shifted. Marcus Leland published the investigation at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. The headline was restrained, not sensational. Private contractor deployed unverified intel in fatal marine operation, documents suggest. The article did not accuse recklessly. It laid out internal Vanguard correspondence, the satellite confidence warning, the deployment timeline, the K9 reassignment log. It did not mention Gideon Hale by name. It did not need to. By noon, the story was circulating nationally. By evening, a congressional oversight committee announced a formal review. 2 days later, the FBI confirmed it had opened an inquiry into Vanguard Tactical Solutions regarding contract misrepresentation and falsified operational readiness documentation. Suspension of federal contracts followed within the week. It was not fireworks, it was paperwork. And paperwork, Gideon realized, could dismantle more quietly than any rifle. Marcus drove up again 3 days after publication. He looked more exhausted than triumphant. Dark circles pooled under his eyes. His beard had grown uneven from neglect. The adrenaline that usually animated him was subdued. "They're denying everything publicly," Marcus said, stepping inside the cabin and stamping snow from his boots. "But they're scrambling behind closed doors." Ronan watched him from near the stove, posture neutral but observant. "They've suspended 3 senior executives pending internal review," Marcus continued. "One of them signed the deployment override." Gideon nodded once. "Charges? Federal contract fraud, potential reckless endangerment tied to operational negligence. It'll take time." "How long?" Marcus gave a thin smile. "Months, maybe years." Snow rattled against the window. "There's more," Marcus added, lowering his voice slightly. He pulled a printed email transcript from his coat pocket. A former Vanguard intelligence analyst reached out after the article. Gideon's eyes sharpened. "Name?" "Daniel Rourke." Marcus handed him the page. Daniel Rourke had worked as a mid-level data analyst for Vanguard's intelligence division, 35 at the time of the mission. Described by colleagues as meticulous, almost rigidly ethical. He had resigned 2 months after Gideon's operation. In his statement to Marcus, Rourke confirmed what the emails suggested. He had flagged the satellite imagery as inconclusive. He had recommended delay. His memo had been altered before submission to the executive board. The language softened, the risk downgraded. "I was instructed to adjust the phrasing to reflect acceptable operational probability," Rourke wrote. "I did not agree with the decision." Gideon read the line twice. "You believe him?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "His timeline matches internal metadata logs." The cabin was quiet except for the stove's low crackle. "Atlas died because someone edited a sentence," Gideon said. Marcus didn't respond. There was nothing to add. 2 weeks later, Vanguard's federal contracts were officially suspended pending investigation. 3 executives were indicted on charges related to falsified readiness documentation. Stock values plummeted. News vans gathered outside corporate headquarters in Virginia. Cable news debated defense contractor accountability. But none of it felt cinematic. None of it erased what had happened in that desert. Gideon stood on the frozen shoreline that morning, Ronan beside him. Lake Superior remained steel gray. Justice did not melt snow. It did not resurrect. It did not rewind. Truth was not a miracle. It was documentation. It was testimony. It was slow. Marcus called again one afternoon. "There's something you should know," he said. "What?" "The Department of Defense is reopening the casualty review for your unit." Gideon closed his eyes briefly. "Meaning?" "Atlas's official record will be amended." The words struck harder than expected. Amended. Corrected. For 3 years, the mission had been cataloged as tactical misjudgment under unpredictable insurgent activity. Now it would state that the deployment proceeded under knowingly unverified intelligence supplied by contracted oversight. Atlas would no longer be listed as collateral in operational chaos. He would be listed as fallen in a compromised deployment. It was subtle, but it mattered. The cemetery sat just south of Duluth, overlooking a narrow stretch of land where Lake Superior met forested hills. Rows of white headstones cut through snow in geometric silence. The wind was gentler there. Gideon wore his gray t-shirt beneath the red and black flannel, sleeves rolled despite the cold. Dark jeans, boots leaving steady impressions in snow. Ronan walked at his side without leash, staying precisely aligned. The groundskeeper, an older man named Harold Jensen, spotted them from a distance. Harold was in his late 60s, stooped slightly from years of tending land in brutal winters. His face carried the patient lines of someone who had buried friends long before retirement. "You're Hale," Harold said softly as Gideon approached. "Yes." Harold nodded toward the far row. "They updated the plaque this morning." Gideon felt his pulse steady rather than spike. They walked in silence. Atlas's marker stood clean against snow. The inscription now included an addendum: "Fallen in service under compromised operational oversight." It was not dramatic. It did not accuse by name, but it acknowledged truth. Gideon stood still for a long time. Ronan sat beside him, posture steady. He removed Atlas's collar from inside his jacket. The nylon had warmed slightly from his body heat. 3 weeks ago, it had been hidden in a drawer. Now it rested openly in his hands. He knelt. The snow soaked through denim slowly. "I thought it was my failure," he said quietly, not to the grave, but to the air. Wind moved across the cemetery in low breaths. "I thought I sent you into something I should have seen." He paused. "But I didn't." The words felt heavier than relief. They did. Ronan lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in stillness. Gideon placed the collar carefully at the base of the headstone. He did not clutch it afterward, did not pull it back. He let it rest there, a final act of acknowledgement. Harold stood respectfully several yards away, hat in hand. "You serving with him?" Harold asked gently. "Yes." "Good dog?" "The best." Harold nodded once. "They usually are." There was no ceremony, no bugle, no applause, just snow, just truth. Gideon stood slowly. He felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not rage, not grief in its rawest form. Clarity. The guilt that had wrapped around his spine for 3 winters loosened. Not because Atlas was gone, not because Vanguard executives faced courtrooms, but because the narrative had changed. He had not miscalculated, he had not failed, he had been used. That distinction did not erase loss, but it removed self-condemnation. Ronan rose as well, stepping closer to the headstone briefly before turning back toward the path. Alive. Because someone had removed him from a manifest. Atlas dead, because someone had not. But that line no longer belonged to Gideon's conscience. It belonged to evidence. As they walked back toward the truck, Harold called after him softly. "Some men carry ghosts their whole lives." Gideon stopped. "Some don't have to," Harold added. The wind carried the words away. That night the cabin felt different. Not safer, not brighter, but balanced. The investigation continued. Lawyers argued. Corporate spokespeople deflected. Trials would take months to resolve. Justice was not immediate. It was procedural. Marcus called to say Rourke would testify under federal protection. Another former logistics coordinator had come forward to confirm data alterations. The case strengthened, but none of it felt miraculous. No lightning struck. No dramatic confession played on television screens. Just documents, depositions, hearings, truth stitched slowly through bureaucracy. Gideon stood by the window that evening as snow fell lightly across Lake Superior. Ronan rested near the door as always, watchful, grounded. 3 years ago, Gideon had returned from war, carrying silence like armor. Now he carried something else. Not peace exactly, but absence of blame. He glanced toward the empty space in the nightstand drawer. No collar, no hidden weight. Atlas rested where he should. In record, in memory, in truth. Gideon Hale had survived, and this time, he had returned. 6 months later, the ice on Lake Superior began to crack. It did not shatter all at once. It fractured in slow, echoing seams that ran beneath the surface like quiet decisions. The snow receded in patches across the shoreline north of Duluth, revealing dark earth that had waited patiently beneath white weight. Spring in Minnesota was not dramatic. It was persistent. Gideon Hale stood at the edge of the lake one early April morning, boots damp from thawing ground. The air carried the scent of wet pine and cold water. Ronan lay beside him, head resting on crossed paws, amber eyes half-lidded but attentive. The investigation into Vanguard Tactical Solutions continued its slow course through courtrooms and committee hearings. Contracts remained suspended. 2 executives had entered plea negotiations. The case would take years to conclude fully. But Gideon no longer measured time by legal outcomes. He measured it by what he chose to build. The Minnesota Canine Reintegration Initiative operated out of a refurbished agricultural warehouse just outside Duluth. The program had been small before winter, mostly volunteer-based, underfunded, reliant on donations and stubborn optimism. Its director, Thomas Keller, was a former Army canine handler in his late 40s. Thomas was broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with a shaved head and a beard that had gone prematurely gray. His right knee stiffened slightly when he walked, the result of an IED blast that ended his deployment early. He spoke plainly, rarely raised his voice, and believed strongly that working dogs deserve structured retirement, not abandonment. When Gideon first arrived at the facility 3 months earlier, Thomas had studied him quietly. "Your recon?" Thomas had asked, noting posture and bearing. "Yes." "Looking to volunteer?" Gideon had hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Thomas had nodded once. "Good. We need people who understand discipline without fear." The facility housed 5 retired canines when Gideon joined. Each carried history in their gait. There was Odin, a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois with a missing tip on his left ear and a tendency to circle doorways repeatedly before settling. His handler had died overseas. Odin had been retired abruptly without transition support. There was Marla, a black Labrador trained for explosives detection, whose once glossy coat had dulled from stress-related shedding. She startled easily at loud sounds, but leaned heavily into gentle contact. And there was Ronan. He did not reside full-time at the facility. He remained with Gideon, but 3 days a week, Gideon brought him in to assist with training. Ronan had adapted to the environment with quiet precision. He did not posture dominance. He did not seek conflict. He observed first. Thomas watched him one afternoon as Ronan demonstrated controlled perimeter scanning without command. "That dog's had advanced tactical training," Thomas said. "Yes." Thomas didn't press further. He didn't need the story to understand its weight. Gideon began small, structured walks, controlled exposure to civilian stimuli, gradual desensitization sessions for dogs triggered by sirens or machinery. He did not brand himself as founder. He did not give speeches. He showed up. He worked. Ronan proved especially effective during stabilization sessions. When a recently retired Army Ranger named Cole Ramirez arrived at the facility seeking help, Thomas introduced him carefully. Cole was 29, tall and lean, with dark hair cropped close and a faint tremor in his hands that betrayed nights without sleep. His left forearm bore a faded tattoo of crossed rifles. After his second deployment, Cole had returned home with acute PTSD. Sudden noise sent him to the floor instinctively. Sleep was fractured and unreliable. "You're not alone here," Thomas had told him on intake day. Cole had nodded without meeting anyone's eyes. Gideon approached him during one session with Ronan. "This dog's steady," Gideon said quietly. "You don't command him. You breathe." Cole glanced skeptically at Ronan. Ronan remained seated, waiting. Cole sat cautiously on a folding chair. His breathing quickened when a forklift engine started outside the warehouse. Ronan shifted without command. He rose, moved toward Cole, rested his head gently against Cole's thigh. Not heavy, grounded. Cole's breath slowed incrementally. Thomas watched from across the room. "He does that?" Thomas murmured to Gideon. "Yes, that's advanced stabilization response." "Yes." Cole exhaled deeply, fingers relaxing slightly against Ronan's fur. "He's not nervous," Cole whispered. "No," Gideon replied. "He's trained." Cole nodded once. It was the first time he had held steady eye contact with anyone since arriving. Ronan did not replace Atlas. He was not meant to. He stood as something different. Proof. Late in April, Gideon received a voicemail he had ignored once before. Sarah Whitaker. He stared at the phone for a long moment before returning the call. Sarah's voice carried the same calm steadiness as months earlier. "We're hosting a Veterans Community Night this Thursday," she said. "No speeches required, just attendance." Gideon hesitated. 6 months ago, he would have declined without explanation. Now he paused differently. "I'll be there," he said. The Duluth Veterans Outreach Center had filled modestly by the time he arrived Thursday evening. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, coffee brewing in the corner, a bulletin board lined with local support resources. Sarah stood near the entrance greeting arrivals. She wore a navy sweater and jeans, auburn hair loosely tied back. Her eyes held the same steady empathy as before, direct but never invasive. When she saw Gideon, her expression shifted. Surprise first, then warmth. "I'm glad you came," she said simply. He nodded. Ronan walked beside him, calm and composed. Not a spectacle, just present. The room quieted slightly as they entered, not from judgment, but recognition. Many veterans recognized posture before introductions. Sarah gestured toward an empty chair. When it was Gideon's turn to speak, silence stretched gently. He did not rehearse. "My name's Gideon Hale," he began. His voice did not falter. "I led a recon team 3 years ago. We lost 2 Marines. And a dog." He paused. For years that sentence had tightened his throat. Tonight, it settled cleanly. "I believed it was my failure." A few heads nodded in understanding. It wasn't. He did not elaborate on Vanguard. He did not list legal proceedings. He did not dramatize. "I spent 3 years hiding from that belief." Ronan rested quietly at his feet. Turns out truth doesn't fix everything, but it changes where the weight sits. No one clapped. They didn't need to. Cole sat across the circle, meeting Gideon's gaze with quiet respect. Sarah's eyes shone faintly. Gideon did not look down. He did not bow his head. He spoke Atlas's name clearly, and that was enough. By May, the ice on Lake Superior had fully broken. Water moved freely again. At the cabin one evening, Gideon stood on the porch watching the lake reflect soft gold from a lowering sun. Ronan lay beside him, body relaxed but alert. The cabin no longer felt like a bunker. It felt like a home. He thought about the mission often still. He remembered Luis's laugh, Brick's stubborn grin, Atlas's unwavering focus. He could not change what happened. He could not undo the ambush. He could not resurrect. But he could choose what came next. The past would always exist, but it no longer dictated every breath. Ronan shifted closer and rested against his leg. Not replacing, not erasing, just present. Gideon reached down and scratched lightly behind Ronan's ear. "You're not him," he said softly. Ronan's tail thumped once, and that's okay. The lake moved freely behind them. Wind carried warmth rather than bite. Gideon understood something then, with quiet clarity. He could not change the past, but he could refuse to let it continue destroying the future. He did not stand as a hero. He did not stand absolved of loss. He stood as a man who had chosen not to disappear. Ronan remained at his side. Not Atlas, not a replacement, just proof that loyalty survived war. And sometimes, so did the men who carried it. Some stories do not end with explosions or headlines. They end with a man standing beside a lake that has finally thawed, no longer running from his past. Gideon could not change what happened in the desert. He could not bring Atlas back. He could not erase the years he spent blaming himself. But he learned something greater than revenge and greater than vindication. Truth may not feel like a miracle. It does not fall from the sky in light and thunder. It comes slowly, quietly, sometimes through a wounded dog behind a convenience store. And maybe that is how God works, not always through spectacle, but through second chances, through unexpected companions, through loyalty that refuses to die. Ronan did not replace Atlas. He reminded Gideon that love and duty do not end with loss, that even after betrayal, after grief, after years of silence, grace can still find a way back into a man's life. If you believe that God can turn even the darkest chapter into a new beginning, take a moment right now and write Amen in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Share this story with someone who may still be carrying guilt they were never meant to carry. And if this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and help us continue telling stories of loyalty, redemption, and hope. Tonight, I pray for every viewer who feels like they survived something, but never truly came home. May you find peace, may you find truth, and may you discover that even after war, even after loss, love is still waiting at your side.